You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Farhad. I hope you are all doing well and staying safe. I can't believe the summer is almost over, but I guess it is. School is just around the corner. One thing, I was just talking to a colleague of mine about summer vacations is for some reason, when I was a kid, it seemed a lot longer than it seems for my kids today, but that might just be because we're older. But um, we had a good one and looking forward to, I guess, the fall and school starting and everything like that. So we have another really great guest today, retired United States Secret Service agent David O'Connor. Welcome, David. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Farhad. Glad to be here and appreciate you extending the invitation.
Absolutely. I'm pretty excited about having you on today. I think it's a timely discussion. And, for context, I met David through our senior advisor, Ed Hartnett. So, David, could you go provide a broad overview of your career for our audience, those that may not know you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And, when you mention the Secret Service, it really seems like it's way in the past. I've been retired now for almost 11 years, but I spent about just 26 plus years with the Secret Service, retiring in 2011, I guess it was, as the Assistant Director of the Office of Investigations. And fortunate enough through that portion of my professional development to have experienced almost everything you could within the Secret Service. Had a great time. Time in the field office, leading investigations. Time with the president's detail, and then culminating, I think, during my excuse me, my time running the Dignitary Protected Division and the amount of national special security events, et cetera, that we got to see during that time frame. Everything from accompanying Queen Elizabeth to the Kentucky Derby, to our United Nations events, to political conventions, etc., and just the global travel. It was an amazing experience, and getting to get a taste of all the flavors of what the Secret Service has to offer was truly just an amazing experience. Following my retirement, I was very fortunate to be able to ultimately return home to the greater Boston area. People may detect there's just a bit of a Boston accent, but I spent about 7 plus years with a major private equity firm up here in the greater Boston area, where it was a great introduction of moving from the government sector into the private sector, especially the business sector. And it was like learning from a fire hose or drinking from a fire hose, because it was coming out of an institution like the Secret Service, where we did things pretty much one way, and moving into the private sector and developing that whole new realm or way of thinking was a great experience as well. As I mentioned, I spent about 7 plus years there, and then I moved over to one of the largest companies in the United States that not many people have heard of, Thermo Fisher Scientific, as their chief security officer. They've got about 122,000 employees and close to about 800 sites globally. And I don't know that anybody goes through a day without being impacted by something Thermo Fisher has their hands in. All the medicines, all the medical equipment, all the technology that's out there. They're truly on the leading cutting edge in that sphere. And I happened to be there throughout the COVID when Thermo became a major player in not only the distribution, production, manufacturing of vaccines, et cetera, but continues to lead the way with that. So that's my soliloquy on a little bit of my background or my history in both the private sector and the public sector.
Yeah, I mean, a lot to unpack there, and we'll go through components of it as we go through the episode. But you already kind of alluded to it, but where'd you grow up, and how'd you become a Secret Service agent?
Well, as easily detected, I grew up in the greater Boston area, about 5 miles from downtown. Spent my entire childhood and my rearing all in, the way things used to be, all in one home with a nuclear family, mother, father, 6 siblings, and great education through the Catholic school system up here in Boston. And biggest move for me was going up to Vermont to Norwich University, which is a small private military school in Vermont, where I spent 4 years and chose the route of not going ROTC, like many of my classmates and friends who went on to illustrious careers in the military. And upon graduation, I was very intrigued by federal service, everything from the FBI, Secret Service, and some of the other alphabet soup agencies that are out there. But ultimately, I chose the Secret Service, or potentially the Secret Service chose me. And thankfully, it was a good union. I mentioned earlier, I had a great career, which I could never have imagined as a kid growing up. Again, in a small family, the son of a Teamster, and it was amazing the places around the world I got to go and I got to see. I did know during my college career I wanted to do something different. I didn't want the 9 to 5 sitting behind a desk or
Yep.
sales or something like that. My personality certainly doesn't lead to the sales sides of thing, which I'm learning slowly as I've developed my own firm with my partner Mike Novak. But it's basically all based on relationships, and many of those relationships even go back to the time when I was a kid, and knowing many of the folks I grew up with who are, like I mentioned, either retired military now, retired law enforcement, but keeping those folks close at hand because they're often the people you spend the time with as a youngster. They come back around as you get a little bit older.
Sure. No, absolutely. So what are some of the things that stick out? You mentioned travel. I'm sure the people are very top on your list in terms of things that you remember about the Secret Service. But can you talk a little bit about what sticks out to you the most?
You know, Warhad, you mentioned, and I apologize, the people, the solitary focus on the mission, which was to obviously a zero fail mission. No one ever wanted to be the person that allowed something happen. And you were surrounded by many people who were very like minded, very committed to the particular mission we were focused on, whether it was the protection side of the house, which probably gets the most notoriety, or what we were doing in the Office of Investigation, which was often cutting edge, leading the way, and yet receives the least fanfare. Everything from our counterfeit investigations to our fraud investigations, and now highly involved in what goes on in the cyber world. I would say the Secret Service personnel are the best. Again, that's where I came from, so I'm going to say that, and I believe it. But they were truly on the cutting edge with what they were doing in cyber. To try to singularly focus on one thing within the Secret Service, again, as I told you, I wasn't a 9 to 5 type person that wanted to be behind a desk. And I think that may have been one of the best things about the Secret Service is every day was different.
Yeah.
Again, you could be in one of the worst neighborhoods in one of the worst cities working criminal cases on a Monday, and by later in the week, you were potentially out at President Reagan's ranch or up in Kennebunkport or traveling the world with many of our protectees at the time. So it was always different, and yet very focused, very intense. And as I said earlier, it was the people, and it was the people and the mission that I would say I missed. Do I miss the long hours? Do I miss the not being around on holidays, birthdays, travel? Certainly not. But I do think of those folks that are still out there on the mission when it comes to a Labor Day weekend or a Christmas time, and
Sure.
knowing that these folks are still out there and doing the job.
One of the things I love about doing the show is having folks like yourself on here talking directly. I mean, this is not through a third party or someone that doesn't know about it or didn't do it or anything like that. Talking about that mission, talking about the sacrifices that you guys made to protect the country. And, I think that that's important to get, it's one of the things I really like about it is that people get to hear direct from the people that did it. And, I think in sort of like this era of like social media and everything else, which obviously is great in many, many ways, sometimes the good stuff gets lost. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And so you decided to call it quits after 26 years. What was it that made that decision for you?
Well, in my case, I can strictly say it was a financial decision. I had
Okay.
three children coming up on college age, and they had, along with my wife, we had moved several times, and I had made a commitment along the way with my family that when the time came, we would try to get back to the greater Boston area, and that whatever school my kids were able to get into, I would try to find a way to make it so that it was economically feasible for them to go there. So, in an effort to capitalize upon what I thought I brought to the table after my career, I moved on into the private sector. And honestly, again, with zero regrets of what I'd done professionally, it was great to be able to capitalize, monetize a little bit, and
Yep.
go out there and see what was on the other side of the ledger in the private sector. And but my retirement was again, you run a life cycle during your time in the government, and hopefully most people know when it's time to move on and move up, move on. And I think I was there, and I was really looking forward to the challenge and the adventure of moving into the private sector. And again, it's been a great 11, 12 years now with two different positions, and now co-owning my own firm with my partner is again, we continue to learn, we continue to evolve, we continue to develop, and I think we're able to bring some really value added services to the table with our past experience.
Sure. No, absolutely. So, I guess before we jump into the meat of the episode, last thing I'd ask is, again, our show is called Investigation Insiders, where we again peel back the layers on things and look behind the curtain. And so, one of the things that we know our audience loves is just stories, right? War stories. So, to the extent that you can, is there anything that you could share with us that encapsulates your time with the Secret Service?
Well, as it's titled, Investigations Insider, and I retired as the Assistant Director of the Office of Investigations, which is probably one of the largest sectors of the Secret Service. I will tell you that although it doesn't get the fanfare of the protective side of the house, the duality of the mission, probably some of the best memories or the most quote unquote fun that I had during my time in the agency was working investigations back in the mid 80s when I came on the job. The amount of counterfeit currency that was in circulation and the old fashioned printing presses that was still being used before we moved on to color copiers, monochromatic copiers, and computer copiers. Just in back in the old days, which I hate to say that I'm not that old, I don't think, of going after the counterfeiters and going after the fraudsters that were out there, which they come in every shape and size, every dimension, every neighborhood, every really, it was great sinking your teeth into an investigation when you know that somewhere, somehow, someone is being defrauded or losing money, whether
Yep.
it's a private citizen or the U.S. government. Again, I,
Yep.
I mentioned the singular focus on the mission, but the time we had in the Office of Investigations, staying in front of what was going on in the world with again, talked about the evolution into the cybercrime. It was great. I truly enjoyed it, and I know now the Secret Service continues to focus on that. People don't realize we even had agents assigned into NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, where we played a quite a great role in helping to develop and work in that sphere, which obviously is doesn't receive the recognition that it does. And Secret Service continues to do that as you look now at what they're doing with some of the mass shootings that are out there and trying to break down the psychology of what causes these and what can be looked for. And I know my partner Mike and I use a lot of what we learned in that realm of being preventive versus reactive. And a lot of that, again, comes out of the days working in the Office of Investigations.
Yep. Well, I'll tell you one thing: as much as crime and criminals and everything else evolves, there are certain things that stand the test of time, and fraud is definitely one of those areas. So I imagine that again, the involvement of the Secret Service and what they're doing now has evolved even more. So that's really interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. So, as you alluded to, David, what you and Mike Novak are now doing is providing services related to safeguarding people, right? Families, high net worth individuals, companies, and all that sort of stuff. And that's part of the sort of inspiration for this is that we were collaborating on something and talking about a bunch of different aspects as it relates to that. And I thought it would be considering your background with the Secret Service and having done that for the public sector and then done it for privately for a couple of different companies and now on your own, I thought it would make sense to talk a little bit about the various factors involved with protecting notable people and their families. So, perhaps we could start with understanding. Again, we're not going to get into every single detail, but a broad overview of what you think are the biggest threats facing high net worth and notable individuals and their families.
That's an excellent question, and we could spend the next couple of hours diving into that. So, again, you mentioned what Mike and I are doing. I think bringing our backgrounds from government service and then being in some major corporations has given us a lens um, that really allows us to see maybe what some other folks aren't seeing.
Yeah.
We want to, as I used to say in the Secret Service during presidential campaigns, our job was to make it so that the candidate, the protectee, was safe and could go on to run for office and never have to worry about that and just go about their business and we'd take care of the rest. Similarly, as we work with high net worth individuals and mid cap companies, which we're doing a little bit more work for it as they're not ready to maybe evolve into bringing on their own chief security officer, but they do need the reliance upon some folks that have maybe been there, done that, and can help them avoid some third rails or some pitfalls. What we're seeing a lot of is we want to be, as I mentioned earlier, preventive versus reactive. We want to help them to put in place some safeguards that keep them and their families maybe off the radar or just doing things that allow them to, as I mentioned, continue to go about their business, be successful. But in the background, we're looking out for things. Is there anyone with an unnatural direction of interest towards a family member or towards the business? Is there a disgruntled employee that from the inside may be doing something nefarious to affect the company or to affect the bottom line? We want to make it so that less of the focus of the folks in the C-suite or in the family office is on that, and we take on a lot of that reliance where we're looking out for what potentially could be bad actors or just honestly, we also in some instances need to protect folks from themselves, and this goes down to education. Are we doing the right thing in phishing campaigns? Are we doing the right thing in intrusion campaigns? Are we making sure that your firewalls are locked down? And again, a lot of the folks that are out there trying to develop business, we try to take that off their plate of responsibility and make sure we partner with them and with the best providers to make sure that they can go about their business and not end up becoming reactive because we've got preventive measures in place. I know to me, the most valuable thing in my life is my family. I don't want to, were I to be one of these individuals or big companies, I don't want to be, of course, we all worry about our children and we worry about our families. We try to lessen some of that worry or lessen some of their concern, whether they're traveling to somewhere that, again, there's more bad actors or there's unknowns. Are we properly prepared medically? Are we properly prepared if there's any type of uprising or any type of domestic conditions in that country that would warrant removal or leaving that country. So we generally try to look at the broader sphere of the what ifs that I think people maybe coming from a business background would not be as focused on.
Sure, sure. One of the things that we always find interesting is People tend to, like, you're talking about proactive versus reactive, right? So people tend to, there's an incident and immediately they get into reaction mode and taking sort of like stopgap measures, which again, you may have to. So we understand that. But, we are keen on, like in that proactive mode, assessing what your risks are. Obviously, everybody's risks are not the same, right? So our philosophy is, assess what your risks are before deploying resources. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you assess risk?
Another great question is our goal is to try to eliminate risk, but again, it's the thing that you're least prepared for that comes up and bites you in the proverbial backside. And you're always wondering, well, where the hell did that come from, or how did I miss that? So, in evaluating risk, there's so many factors you can take into consideration, everything from physical risk, cyber risk. And you know what, Farhad, the thing that some people forget is sometimes accidents happen. There's a reason they're called an accident, but how well are you then prepared to deal with that accident? Do you have the right training in place? Do you have the right methodologies? Have you thought it out? So risk, and as I looked at some of the larger companies that I was with, and they each had a chief risk officer. And when I'd sit with them, and at the end of the day, we'd both look and say, well, what isn't a risk? And it's pretty hard to determine what isn't a risk, right? You take a risk every time you walk out the front door.
Yep.
Some of it you want to get to an acceptable level of risk. And again, there's so many risks that you can just completely minimize by knowing your surroundings, knowing who's going to be there, knowing what's going on in a certain environment or a certain client, knowing who the people on the other side of the table are, knowing a little bit about their background. And again, it's minimizing risk. You cannot eliminate risk. It's just not doable. And anyone that tells you they will completely eliminate any risk, I would say run, don't walk, because it's just not possible. I could get up from this chair later and, God forbid, trip, fall, and break an ankle or do something. And so again, our goal is to minimize the risk, to put in front of you a myriad of options as to what you can do to take to levels of risk that you'd be acceptable with, and just point out some of the risks that, from a business perspective, Mike and I have seen that we want to make sure people don't make the same mistake twice. Because I had a saying with when we'd be out on the streets of, once you get punched in the face, you never want to get punched in the face again. So
Yep.
you want to minimize that risk, and you want to do everything you can to eliminate it, if possible. Which, again, not completely possible.
Yep. No, I think that's a great point. And so at a high level, right? What are the components of a security program meant to protect, you know, high net worth individuals and notable families?
Another great question, Fahad. People automatically assume the physical, barricades, cameras, alarms, and they're great, and we are huge proponents of making sure you have the right technology in place. But in today's day and age, let's start taking a look at reputational, right? All it takes is somebody to get on one of the social media companies, Twitter. I am the least educated when it comes to all of them, but fortunately, I have kids that are really good. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Reputational harm can be so serious, and in when you look at some of the individuals, are you protecting your family? What are your children posting? You think you have a very low profile socially, yet you can look up some of these folks and find out that their children are posting every dinner they go to with the family, or we're on a cruise today in Morocco, or we're over here today in Greece, or in the islands or someplace. Although the principals may not be posting or doing something like that, trying to keep those types of harms or dangers away from some of the younger generations who don't realize that they're being geotagged everywhere they go, and they're basically letting people know where they are, what they're doing. And if you're sending pictures from the 200-foot yacht, I know David O'Connor can't go lease a 200-foot yacht, so potentially you're talking about some high net worth individuals that would maybe increase their profile or make them more inviting as a target.
Yep.
So everything from physical to reputational to cyber.
Yep.
If you know, with cyber hacks and cyber attacks, you've got people sitting in their pajamas behind a computer screen for 24 hours a day, potentially trying to get into your networks, and they only have to be right once. And if you've
Yep.
allowed, a hole in your network or a hole in your firewall, and you're not doing all of your patching, and you're not staying on top of this, again, risk. You've
Yep.
opened yourself up to a greater type of risk that could potentially be extremely damaging. As we know today, a lot of thieves, it's not like the old days, maybe with a mask and a gun walking into a bank. A lot of it's done behind a keyboard and a laptop and just trying to find the right way into a company or right into an individual. And then when we look at some of the social engineering for hard, it's amazing. People passing themselves off as one thing when they're completely something else, and endearing themselves to individuals, and then finding again loopholes or holes in the firewall to make sure that they could get in. And often once it's gone, it doesn't come back.
Yep. All just excellent points. And it's interesting because like every time you hear that sort of thing, you think you know it, but it's amazing to me how quickly people forget. So training is like anything else. It's just repetition of the same subject matter over and over again, hoping that something seeps in each time. So interestingly, one of my mentors when I was very young was a Secret Service. So you talk about sales and things like that, but a Secret Service agent. He wasn't retired. He left early. His name was Jim Antonelli. He was out of Chicago, and he helped me a lot early on in my career. And Jim would always talk about everybody is a salesperson. Anyone that tells you that they're not just doesn't know it, right? And you're constantly selling yourself, whatever the reason and application that may be. And what he always talked about is people always buy people first, right? And then they buy into whatever it is that you're trying to sell, whether it's a product, whether it's a service, or a program, right? So obviously, you got to pretty high levels within the Secret Service and then since, right? Can you talk a little bit about how you get buy-in? Because I think that's one of the difficult things is that sometimes the people you're trying to protect are disinterested, right? Or don't take it as seriously. Can you talk a little bit about how to get buy-in from the principals or their handlers when security is not, that it's a cost, it's an expense, it's an inconvenience?
Again, really good point. One of the terms, the Secret Service, the government, we probably had more acronyms than you could imagine. Until I get out in the private sector and I realized, okay, there's a whole different language that folks speak out here. And one of the terms, ROI, right? What's the return on investment? Which, when you now being a business owner, as we go into any conversation, I know on the other side of the table, the principal or the company is sitting there, well, what's my return on? What am I going to get in return for this investment?
Right.
Am I going to get, a complete lockdown? They're not going to breach my firewall, or am I going to get it complete that I know my children are safe? What is the return on my investment? So that's something we always have to look at. You brought up something that, and again, we've said Secret Service more times than I've probably said since I retired,
Yep.
and I certainly wanted to stay away from that. But one of the things that I would credit the agency with when I retired and others that are out there is it. And I'm going to use a bad word. I don't know what our audience would be, but the Secret Service made you kind of a human bullshit detector. You knew fairly quickly into a conversation with someone whether they
Yep.
were full of it, whether they were actually going to be deliver on what they were saying, whether they were actually taking notes and were going to act upon what they were talking about. And you just developed an 11th sense, for lack of a better term, where you knew pretty quickly if this was someone you wanted to continue doing business with, someone you wanted to count on, someone that you knew would be there to have your back in a certain instance. And I will credit the Secret Service with really giving you that way because of doing criminal investigations, criminal interviews, learning, and then the next day being in an embassy somewhere and dealing with heads of state, heads of government, and highly placed people, you truly became a litmus test for, okay, who's real and who's not real. Um, so when we walk in to go back and talk about sales, I think what you'll find with me and Mike when we do end up in this position, and neither one of us honestly likes talking about sales, is we like to say that we are practitioners. We are not folks that, we hang up the phone and then we turn to our staff and say, okay, do this, this, this. We are our staff. We are the people that are going to be the rubber hitting the road. So I think as we bring that into when we deal with people, they realize, oh, okay, this is the person I'm going to be dealing with going forward, not getting passed off to a help desk or passed off to an associate. Certainly, as we continue to grow and expand, there may be an opportunity, but we would bring in very like-minded people, people that we have had experience with over our 30 plus years in this industry, that we know we can call at 3 a.m. and they answer the phone, or we can call them when they're on quote unquote vacation. There really was no vacation back in our old job. You answered the phone or you answered the email when it came, not when it was convenient. I know that may seem strange in today's workplace, but that was just something that was ingrained upon you. So I go back to the BS detector. It was like, you
Yep.
didn't come back after 8 days and say, oh, I'm swamped with all the emails I have to catch up on. You'd
Yep.
get looked at like you had a chicken on your head, like, well, what have you been doing for the last 8 days that you weren't returning your emails or you weren't returning your phone calls? I
Yep.
was on vacation, and you kind of would get laughed at that point.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. No, it's interesting. And again, getting buy-in from people is just being there when you need. I mean, it's almost as simple as that, right? Like when you're there when you're needed, and without any excuses and finding solutions. That's how you get buy-in from people. So I think that's a really great point. You actually already sort of alluded to it earlier, but insider threats, right? Like that's a buzz term now for a lot of people. But I wanted to hear from you. How concerned are you about insider threats, and what recommendations do you have to like prevent that from becoming an issue?
It's a real threat, Farhad. When you think about proprietary information, what's the secret sauce that a company has or a family has or anything like that? We often give the keys of the kingdom to people that don't need them, right? They've got access to either files or into systems within a company that maybe they shouldn't have. And when you look at it, it doesn't take much for someone that is really IT or computer savvy to get permissions or to get access into some company areas. And you know what? Disgruntled employees. We start with layoffs. We start with terminations. We start with, well, what did they have access to? Did we immediately discontinue that access? If we knew this termination or a separation was coming up, were we proactively for the last couple of weeks monitoring, take a look at what somebody had access to? Because often an employee knows or has a feeling that they might be on the verge of being on their way out, and you want to protect both ends, right? You want to protect the company, the institution, the family office. You also want to protect that person on their way out, where you're not like, wait a minute, you need to return XYZ. So if they didn't have access to it, it makes it easier. But insider threat can go a lot further. Mike and I have also been doing some training and some educational material for folks for, you know, I call it what it is, workplace violence, or even, a disgruntled employee on the inside, and trying to get people to just think, again, a little bit more proactively. So an insider threat doesn't have to just be somebody that's on the computer. It can be somebody physically within the office space that, I think when DHS or others came up with it 20 some years ago, with if you see something, say something, you can tell when someone's not acting appropriately. You can tell when Jane or John's um, psyche or whatever has just changed, or they're different, or they're hostile, or they're starting to think, oh, it's all about me. And it takes employees having the wherewithal and knowing that they will be supported within the company if they anonymously or even openly go to HR, go to somebody and say, hey, you know what? Fahad is really acting strange the last couple of days. He's been fixated on this and that. again, this isn't Farhad's real upset because the Patriots lost this weekend or whatever your team is. I know you're in New York, you're not probably a Patriots fan, but um, you start to see the development. And what we've often, and I go back to the NTAC, the National Threat Assessment Center that the Secret Service runs, and they do a lot of these after actions on some of these shootings. And what they find from a lot, not just shootings but workplace violence, what they find in a lot of their interviews and investigations is people saying, yeah, no, he's been acting strange for quite a while, or yeah, he had been talking about doing this for 3, 4 months. Well, how come you didn't report it? Well, I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't want to get that person in trouble. I didn't want to, so again, it goes back to see something, say something, and to the earlier point of the insider threat. It's not just the person with access um, into the computer systems, etc. It's the whole picture, right? It's the 360 view as to what's going on in your environment.
Yep. No, I think that's a great point. So I guess one of the last things I was hoping you could talk about is, again, going back to stories, anecdotes, and without getting into the details of who and what and where, but do you have an anecdote related to a the results of an effective or ineffective program, and what the consequences of that are?
Sure, and it's fairly simple. Take 30 seconds, but when President Obama was first elected, um, again, it was monumental, historic, and we at the time, I think I was the agent in charge of DPD running the campaign, working with his staff and everyone in Washington, D.C., we had to prepare for what potentially became the largest event that ever took place in D.C., which was the President Obama's inauguration, where estimates put it at 1+ million people descending upon D.C. and us working on bus lanes as far as Pennsylvania and West Virginia and New Jersey and bringing it all in. And at the end of the day, the next morning when we looked, all our partners, I mean, this Secret Service was just not a small player, but we were a player in this with everybody from Park Police, FBI, DOD, the president's staff, the inaugural staff, some of my still very good friends from the White House staff at the time. And when we look back at it the next day, that event occurred, and there was zero arrests in the District of Columbia with having to do with the president's inauguration that day. And if you look, one of the few that I have in my home office, one of the few pictures I have is it's an overhead showing the National Mall during the president's inauguration. And when I tell you it's people as far as you can see, whether you're starting up at the Capitol building, going to the Washington Monument, down past the Lincoln Monument, through the World War II, it was just a sea of people. And the way we had planned with walkout orders of, signage, massive signs everywhere we could coordinate with, telling people, go this way if there was an incident, go that way, right? We had dump plans of, do we send people over bridges to Virginia? Do we send them into Maryland? Do we go a different part of the district? And it all went off fairly seamlessly. And, the next day with finding out, because we were dealing with the governor of Maryland, the governor of Virginia, the mayor of D.C., all over the place, that there had been zero arrests and really zero incidents. That wasn't by accident. That was months and months and months of planning. And I know as the agency continues doing those events moving forward, each one evolves and we learn from the one in the past. But to me, that was just a great lesson in planning, preparing, getting the right people at the table, running tabletops, getting decision makers, not people that were going to have to say, oh, I have to call and ask. No, we had the decision makers right there at the desk, at the table. And again, it was success. We would say the best thing in the Secret Service when you did these advances was, yeah, that advance is over. You're on to the next one. We didn't sit around talking about, oh, did you see what we did? You were literally the next day, the president was going to go someplace, and you were planning on that. Or you had the United Nations General Assembly coming up, or you had a Asian Pacific Economic Conference. You were literally on to the next one. But again, it was the planning and execution and the training that went into the success of all those events.
Well, that is a fantastic story, and really does encapsulate how, you planning and being proactive really it increases your chances of success. So thank you for sharing that. And so, that concludes our episode. I just again, as our audience knows, we just every company like ours relies on strong partners that complements their own skill sets and their own team skill sets. And so we look forward to working with David and Mike going into the future. But also, again, we're going to put his company and his contact information in the description of the podcast. Feel free to reach out to him directly as well. One of the things, David, I could tell you is that I'm both empathetic and sympathetic myself, my partners, and my main partner, Tony Picciano. We've been through what you're going through now, and we understand sort of like the excitement and the challenges associated with it. And I can tell you 1,000% that we could not have gotten to where we got to without so many people helping us along the way through advice, through opportunities, through partnerships. And so we look forward to seeing the future for your organization and where it is in the next couple of years, 5 years, and however long you guys want to do it for. So congratulations on making the jump into entrepreneurship. Needless to say, I'm a big fan of that, and I wish you the best of luck, and thank you for joining us today.
Farhad, again, thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it moving forward. I think the one thing I neglected throughout, and I know you said you'd post it, which that's fine. We're fairly low key, but Mike Novak and we are the founders and managing partners of GSD Strategic Security Services, and greatly appreciate this opportunity. As Farhad, as you alluded to, it's all about relationships and knowing the right people and knowing who to call at the right time. And you've become a good partner to us. We greatly appreciate it. And again, we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone tuning in. Till the next episode, have a great one.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.